CNN's Don Lemon is hitting back at Joe Rogan after the podcast host's heated interview with the network's chief medical correspondent, Sanjay Gupta, went viral. Friday night, Lemon had Gupta on his show to discuss Rogan's claims that CNN lied about his use of ivermectin to treat COVID-19. Let's watch.
He did say something about ivermectin that I think wasn't actually correct about CNN and lying, okay? Ivermectin is a drug that is commonly used as a horse dewormer. So it is not a lie to say that the drug is used as a horse dewormer. I think that's important, and it is not approved for COVID. Correct?
That's right. That's correct. It is not approved for COVID, and you're right. I mean, the FDA even put out a statement saying, basically reminding people, it was a strange sort of message from the FDA, but that said, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, stop taking this stuff, is essentially what they said, referring to ivermectin. Now, I think what Joe's point
that
is...
It has been approved for humans, but not necessarily for COVID, right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Oh, gosh. Well, Ryan, you were really critical of this, tweeting out, "This is outrageous on Gupta's part. He had an opportunity to say no. It was wrong for CNN to say he took horse dewormer when, in fact, he didn't. Could be a moment to rebuild credibility. CNN seems to have no interest in that." Yeah, it seems like they don't. I mean, why do you think Sanjay Gupta just refused to push back on this after what had happened on the Rogan podcast? We all saw this. So why do you think he just sat there and said, yeah, okay, horse dewormer?
And what's frustrating is that if you go back and watch that clip again, and people who are watching this online can go back and watch again, there's this moment where Gupta, because I watched it a couple of times, where Gupta says, now, from Joe's perspective, he was, or something along those lines, and then Don Lemon cuts him off. And it seems like that's where Sanjay Gupta was saying, now, what the point that Joe is trying to make is that he was prescribed this by a doctor and that it's people medicine. And as he said, I can afford people medicine.
Right.
But then, so Lemon cuts him off and then moves him in a different direction. And Gupta then has an opportunity to kind of go back to finish his thought. But instead, he just sort of agrees with Lemon and fades into the next portion of the conversation. But, and cable is tough, and all of this back and forth, and it can be hard to get your point across. But it was extremely important for Gupta to get that one point across and say, no, he took medicine that was prescribed by a doctor for a person. Nobody should be going to a veterinary shop and asking for the horse paste and using that to treat themselves. Nobody should do that. At the same time, that is not what Joe Rogan did, and you should not imply that that's what he did. And he had an opportunity to make that point, but he just kind of whiffed, and Don Lemon helped him whiff by kind of like jumping in there as he seemed to be about to make the right point. But do you think this winds up in court?
I wonder about that. After seeing this clip, I was just thinking, I wonder if Joe Rogan is going to end up suing and saying, hey, I didn't take the horse dewormer. I mean, in a lot of ways, I hope he does take them to court, because we do need to rebuild credibility in the media. I mean, this sort of false reporting or misleading reporting is causing so much division. And, I mean, there's got to be something that we do in order to say, look, you guys just can't continue to get away with this when it's a blatant known lie. So I don't know. I mean, I would like to see that somewhat. But then again, then it's like, okay, but where does that lead? Then who else can sue for what? And, it kind of leads to this. Really, just CNN should just do the right thing as a media organization and not say that Joe Rogan took horse dewormer.
Absolutely. Well, over a year before horse dewormer gate, is that what we're calling it? Rogan gave his take on why the major networks are often so unwilling to take accountability for their reporting mistakes.
There's also a problem with mainstream media, and it's the same problem that we have with the police. You're giving people an inordinate amount of power. Mm-hmm. And when you give people that amount of power, they don't want to ever let it go. And they don't ever want to say they're wrong, and they don't ever want to admit fault, and they don't ever want to open the door to nuance.
Correct.
And that's what you see with whether it's CNN or Fox News or any of these motherfuckers. They have this idea that they've been selling you, whether it's this idea about Russia, whether it's the idea about COVID, whether it's the idea about Trump, whether it's the idea about Biden. I mean, they're selling you some shit, and it's very, very difficult to get an unbiased perspective on the world.
Well, which I agree with that, and part of it is actually even just the format. like you were saying, Ryan, because of the way the cable news segment works, it's hard to actually have time. Gupta would have to interject. He has a limited window to get his point out. There's just not that much time for nuance. Whereas actually in the Rogan format, when you talk for 3 hours, you can have an actual conversation. You can have one person be right. I think Rogan was right about a lot of things. I think Gupta made some good points on some other issues. My wife watched the whole thing. She said it was great. She said it was fascinating, a really important exchange. And you can't have that in the TV. It's so much harder to have that in the TV news conversations.
Well, they can. They just choose not to. I mean, ultimately, no one's, especially cable news networks, they're not really up against a clock. It's a manufactured clock. I mean, it's one thing if you're on ABC or NBC and you really only have 1 hour of news and then you go on to entertainment programming. But outlets like CNN and Fox, they absolutely run their own clocks. They can choose to have they do it all the time. They do these long form specials and exposés and whatnot. So they don't have to do it this way, but they choose to. And, they are allowing themselves to reel into becoming something like the National Enquirer. I don't know. I think the National, I don't know what they are these days, but I know as a kid growing up, it was always like aliens have impregnated some celebrity.
Yeah. Now they're breaking legitimate news stories sometimes every now and then, right? We don't want to smear the Enquirer. They got who is John Kerry's VP story? Not coming up with his name.
John Edwards.
John Edwards,
chased
right?
him into the bathroom.
Yeah. Right, which we're all against, but.
They did actually chase him into the bathroom.
Yeah.
They quite literally chased him into the bathroom. But then they waited outside and caught footage of him.
Yeah.
So in a rebuke of COVID-19 coverage, anti-mandate protesters took to the streets of New York City over the weekend, congregating in front of the New York Times and chanting, "Defund the media." I don't know what they're talking about there exactly.
Well, we should not be funding the media.
They're probably not subscribers.
Right.
And actually, this is an interesting point. Your funding helps to shape your coverage, and that the New York Times, by becoming the kind of voice of the kind of resistance, the voice of the kind of liberal Democratic Party, now is heavily dependent on subscribers. Who are, like, it used to be that they were more heavily dependent on corporations for the advertising, but you can't make as much money on digital advertising as you can in the print paper. And so now they're much more subscriber heavy. It's not just New York, everyone around the world can subscribe to the New York Times. And every time that they run some op-ed or something that makes their subscribers angry, there's this movement on Twitter and Facebook saying, unsubscribe from the New York Times.
Yeah.
And they respond to that. And so their coverage then increasingly reflects what their viewers want. So the people that can actually defund the New York Times are the pro-mandate people. So the anti-mandate people are going to need to find a different, leverage point with them.
Well, they should be chanting refund the media rather than defund the media. I mean, we'd rather have, I think, in order to correct this issue, which is, either corporate donors shaping the content, or whether it be your hyper partisan readership that shapes the coverage. It really should be maybe public funds. I mean, we should maybe revisit where public funds actually funnel into the news business so that we can get, hopefully, potentially a more unbiased news program.
Well, then you get biased coverage of the Department of Public Funding for newspapers.
Right. Yeah, right. There's always an issue. There's always an issue with the money.
My thought in order to get away from that, because if it's public, if it's some commission that's funding, and then Fauci goes to the commission and says, well, I don't like the way that they're covering this, strip their funding, then that can be problematic. I feel like if you could allow every American to give $100 to a publication or a YouTuber or a podcaster of their choice, or $5 to like 20 of them, and that was somehow covered through the tax code, then that would be individual choice. So the government can't then defund any particular entity, but it's sort of like public. But it's still public financing in a way.
And Joe Rogan would end up even wealthier than he already is.
Yeah, that's a better approach. But then we might have to have an argument about what constitutes a media enterprise or a company. And
as long as there's a work requirement,
Yeah, for the children, right? I want the children in the coal mines first.
Yeah, children can't read the comics until they've finished their chores. Next on Rising, it appears a strike in Hollywood may have been averted, but there's still bargaining taking place. Political and legislative director for IATSE joins us next to detail those negotiations.